The world hasn't exactly been harmonious over the last few years. Everything from global pandemics, economic hardships, political polarization, and even wars. But the more that I find myself studying geopolitics, the more that I start seeing patterns. Patterns that have eerie similarities to another period in history. The years between World War I and World War II were some of the most tense in human history, with everything from global pandemics, economic hardships, political polarization, and yes, even wars. But does that mean that we're headed for another world war just like the last time? Well, that's what we're here today to speculate. One of the first similarities that comes to mind when I'm talking about the pre-World War II era would be how similar Communist China and Imperial Japan have been acting as of late. Outside of the fact that China hasn't tried any violent expansionism yet, its overall goals are pretty similar to that of Meiji-era Japan. Outside of their regional similarities, both seek to establish an East Asian hegemony with themselves as the uncontested power. Both seek to secure their supply chains to be able to produce domestic-made goods without the help of foreign trade, and both have a dangerous over-reliance on oil imports that could be very easily cut off, essentially crippling their economies and war machines. And unsurprisingly enough, both countries were put on a collision course with the US over the same exact issues. Imperial Japan's expansionism led to America becoming more and more weary toward it, and eventually declaring an oil embargo on the country, essentially stripping it of 90% of its energy supply, despite the territory it was taking in order to secure those same energy supply lines. And eventually, as we all know, this led to the 1941 bombing of Pearl Harbor. Now, obviously, Communist China was ideologically opposed to the United States from its inception. However, these issues do exacerbate the problem, and only make it so that further confrontation is more and more likely. Now, it is important to note that China does differ quite a bit from Japan here. The first reason being is that China has actually done a great job making the US, and by extension the rest of the world, much more reliant on it than Imperial Japan ever did. Since China enticed many Western countries to set up their manufacturing in their country, much of the US's economic supply chain is anchored in China. And the same can be said pretty much across the entirety of the Western world, making it much harder for further confrontation. The second reason being China's overall prestige. Now, China propaganda outlets have done a great job of ensuring sympathies towards them in certain Western circles. With the post-World War rise in Western leftism, China has been able to play off a lot of people's ideas and sympathies towards true communism, and has been waging a non-stop propaganda war where they attempt to silence any dissent abroad using the internet, essentially by hiring people to mass flag posts, or to claim that any criticism would be racist, or any kind of coercion of the sort. This has been further exacerbated by the fact that a lot of tech companies in the US are very reliant on China as well. Therefore, China can use that to leverage these companies to censor any criticism towards its regime online or on any one of their platforms. All of these tactics are doing a pretty good job of trying to keep Western dissent towards China in check, therefore making any potential war with China seem less and less worth it, at least towards the common person. And the third big difference being the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, this one is kind of tied to the last 2 points and is more of an extension of the international prestige that China carries. However, when China invests in other countries for infrastructure or road projects or anything of the sort, it makes it very, very easy to buy support abroad in other governments. The problem with this, though, is many of the governments that China invests in cannot reasonably pay back any of the loans that it gives it, therefore inevitably leading to situations like in Sri Lanka where China is able to seize ports and use it for essentially whatever it so desires. Now, it is important to understand that there are legal caveats to making sure that China can't use these as potential military bases. However, in the event of push coming to shove, it is definitely possible that China could seek to seize these as future military bases. And the last one being pretty self-explanatory in nuclear weapons. Obviously, you're going to be a lot less likely to pick a fight with a country that could literally destroy the Earth. The point being is that China shows a level of competence in overall diplomacy that Imperial Japan didn't. Meiji-era Japan definitely took a lot less care in its interactions with the greater world, therefore making it a lot more likely to get into confrontations, and also it didn't have nuclear weapons. Therefore, when push came to shove, it was a lot easier to justify a war against Imperial Japan because they had been aggressively expansionist and didn't do a lot to dissuade the Western societies from actually picking a fight with it. Despite all these differences, however, the similarities in the position that China is increasingly finding itself in compared to that of the position of Imperial Japan are striking. It does seem that China is increasingly pushing itself into a position where it may feel as though that war is unavoidable, similar to that of Imperial Japan leading up to World War II. And using historical precedent like this may provide insights into possible actions that China may take in the future. Alright, so this next similarity I see is one that I'm sure nobody has been able to ignore. The fact that the current Russian invasion of Ukraine really feels a lot like the 1939 Winter War against Finland. Both the Winter War and the war in Ukraine were started over perceived Russian security threats towards its own territorial integrity, with Finland being a great strategic risk for Leningrad, now modern-day St. Petersburg, essentially being able to cut off an important port for Russia in the case of a potential war, and Ukraine potentially allowing NATO forces right on Russia's southern doorstep, which is geographically pretty hard to protect, consisting of mainly flatlands with not a lot of cover and not a lot of area to actually stage good defenses. Now, one of the biggest caveats to this would be the ultimatums that Russia gave their soon-to-be victims were much different. I.e., Russia wanted Ukraine to align more with itself and less with the West, and outright told Finland to cede territory. Many reports in both cases, however, state that when the time came for invasion, Russia had every intention of completely conquering the entirety of both countries, as evidence in the first phase of the war in Ukraine being a failed decapitation attempt. Or in Finland's case, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact had secret articles which insinuated that it did intend to set up a puppet government in Finland. And in both cases, it ended up going extremely poorly. In 1939, years of Russian purges and corruption plagued the military with morale issues and general ineffectiveness. And at the same time, Russia also greatly underestimated its smaller neighbor, citing its own impressive number advantage and seeming technological advantage over the country. Only to find out that when the metal hits the meat, their military wasn't all it was cracked up to be, and was overhyped in order to placate its absolute ruler and line the pockets of corrupt oligarchs and military commanders. And in 2022, these exact same sentiments rang true. In order to placate their absolute ruler and line the pockets of corrupt oligarchs and military commanders, the Russian military greatly underperformed, leading many to see Russia's military as nothing more than a paper tiger, and therefore not take it seriously on the world stage. Something that Nazi Germany took to heart when it was drawing up plans to invade the Soviet Union via Operation Barbarossa. What is interesting, however, is that the war in Ukraine has now gone on significantly longer than the Winter War did. And at the time of writing this video, Ukraine is still unwilling to cede any territory at all to Russia, unlike how Finland did. And in many cases, it's actually looking to take some territory back, like Crimea. It is possible that this war will end up much like the Winter War and result in minor gains from the Russians in order to placate them, but at least at this moment, the results are largely still up in the air. One thing is for sure, though, that this war has undoubtedly changed the landscape of the world and has largely brought many countries back to thinking that war is a possibility and, in some cases, a likelihood. And policies in previously non-aggressive countries have started to change, for better or worse. The next massive similarity that I see between the world today and the world leading up to World War II would be the existence of international organizations like the United Nations. Now, as many of you already know, the UN is not the first international organization with the intention of stopping wars and maintaining global peace. On January 10th of 1920, the League of Nations was established with the goal of maintaining international peace and preventing any future outbreak of war in order to prevent the possibility of another world war. And as I'm sure we're all also very well aware of, the League of Nations was a little less than successful at that. Now, the mere existence of international organizations like this doesn't exactly constitute a direct link between the League of Nations and the UN, but what I'm referring to is the UN's general lack of effectiveness in world affairs as of late. One of the watershed moments for the League of Nations' legitimacy was its inability to both prevent and stop the Sino-Japanese War. In response to international condemnation, the delegation for Japan simply announced that they were going to continue the war anyway and just walked out of the League of Nations Assembly Hall. And that was pretty much it. The League couldn't really do anything to stop them short of getting its member nations to get directly militarily involved. And obviously that kind of goes against the entire principle of the organization, therefore it pretty much just had to let Japan do what it was doing. So therefore the matter of sanctions and retaliation was largely left up to what its individual member states decided they wanted to do. I think you already know where I'm going with this. Earlier this year, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the UN General Assembly voted to demand Russia immediately withdraw its forces. The motion passed convincingly, but was shot down immediately because Russia held the title of President of the UN General Assembly at the time and was able to veto the decision. What's funny is that even if this would have passed, not much would have been done about it, seeing as how that this motion was mainly an official condemnation and wasn't legally binding. Which I feel like makes it even worse, considering that not only could the UN do nothing to put a stop to the invasion, but it couldn't even take a stance on it due to its own inefficiencies. And so far, the only concrete thing that has come out of the UN's attempts at helping Ukraine is a couple $2 billion worth of aid money, which, to be fair, is definitely more than the League of Nations ever did, but considering individual nations were already doing that since the onset of the war, it almost seems like a consolation prize more than anything. But this is far from the first example of UN inefficiency. During the United States' 2001 invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan, which, by the way, is the only time that Article 5 of NATO has ever been triggered, the United Nations found that most of America's actions were going against UN charters, and I don't think I need to tell you that not much was done about it. And more recently, China was able to delay a UN investigation into its human rights abuses in Xinjiang for multiple years, and was still able to force the UN rights chief to be accompanied by state officials. What's bad is that the world was actually shocked to find that Michelle Bachelet, I hope I said that right, still said that significant human rights abuses were taking place, and most people didn't expect to get that far. Effectively, the United Nations has shown time and time again that its actual power to stop wars, prevent human rights abuse, and hold nations accountable is largely non-existent. And these are just the results. I could go more into how belligerent nations get positions of power where they realistically shouldn't. Like how both Russia and China are permanent members of the UN Security Council, which was intended to prevent wars between these major superpowers. However, it largely just serves to gridlock nations who are willing to listen to the UN while allowing belligerent nations to get away with their aggression. Or how China and other nations with atrocious human rights records, such as Qatar, sit on the UN Human Rights Council and are able to pass motions and influence decision-making. Needless to say that the UN isn't exactly the best at doing its job, and in a lot of ways mirrors the same issues that the League of Nations ran into when leading up to World War II. Now, I know that I've made extensive references to Russia and China being some of the main driving forces between today's similarities to the pre-World War II world, but that's mainly due to the fact the world is currently leaning on two axes again, with one being headed by China and the other being headed by the US. With China's axis being centered around authoritarian countries looking to further their own power and are mainly united by the desire of dislodging the Western post-World War II system, which is of course extremely similar to the pre-World War II Axis powers, who are mainly united by a desire to dislodge the Western post-World War I system. Well, that or getting caught between Germany and the Soviet Union, like in the case of Romania or Bulgaria. However, this time around we see much higher stakes, with China's axis being much more competent, powerful, and embedded than Germany's ever was before World War II. However, we do still see similarities between now and then in the way that Western powers interact with these Axis powers. Up until the global pandemic, the world's stance on many of these hostile powers has either been general apathy or, in other cases, outright appeasement. However, recently, due to a number of things like the COVID pandemic, Russian invasion of Ukraine, and general awareness of Russia and China's other allied nations such as North Korea and Iran, the US and Europe have been making much more of a conceited effort to be tough on their adversaries. Which again also greatly mirrors the years leading up to World War II, when much of the allied nations decided to slowly move away from appeasement protocols and more towards a tougher stance on their enemies, which obviously came to a head in 1939 when Germany invaded Poland. I hate to mention this again because I'm starting to sound like a broken record, but the war in Ukraine shows that the West still does have the resolve to take stances like this, albeit so far doing everything besides direct military involvement. Alright, so this final similarity has a lot more to do with domestic politics and less to do with foreign policy. During the aftermath of the First World War, and especially during the 1930s, the US was going through a massive phase of strong isolationism. Now mind you, most of this was due to the Great Depression, where the standard of living was so low that most people saw interacting with people outside of the borders of their own country as a waste of time. Most people were looking to not starve to death, much less deal with the populations of other countries. Now, in no way am I saying that the US is anywhere close to as isolationist now as it was back in the 1930s, seeing as how that level of isolationism is literally untenable now, considering the economies of most countries are so vital to the global system that the United States pulling out of that system would cause a global economic collapse. But what I am saying is we do see this isolationist trend start rising in popularity in the domestic United States. To put things frankly, America doesn't see much incentive in being the world's police force anymore. Now, this sentiment has been something that's been building up for decades, going back as early as the Vietnam War, and even more recently in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan during the early 2000s. Many on the domestic American left wing saw these wars as unjust neocolonialism and largely did not support them. But in recent years, this sentiment has also started to garner a lot of support on the right wing too. Donald Trump's presidency was literally fought and won on the basis of America First isolationist policies. And now with the economic fallout of the COVID pandemic and potential flare-ups for international tension, many on both the right and left increasingly see interactions with other nations, whether they are allies or not, as increasingly dangerous and putting the United States at a disadvantage, with the most recent incident being the speculation of a Russian missile crossing into Polish territory. While to my knowledge not much was ever said in an official capacity, much of the general leftist sentiment was that Poland was being far too aggressive towards Russia and was getting very close to dragging the United States into a war over NATO territory, with some on the left even going as far as claiming that being a part of NATO is too dangerous and immediately wanted the United States to withdraw. Worryingly enough, this isn't even the first time that anti-NATO sentiment has been pervasive throughout the United States. Most infamously, during Donald Trump's presidency, the United States threatened to withdraw from NATO over spending concerns, leaving us with the conclusion that isolationism is a growing trend in United States politics, mirroring that of the 1930s leading up to World War II. Now, while there are other similarities I could bring up, like the rise of political radicalism across the world, or the resurgence of authoritarianism that we see today similar to the rise of authoritarianism after the First World War, or how the muted response towards Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 was very similar to the muted response of Germany's annexation of Austria in 1938, I think I've made my point that the world today is actually very similar to what we saw leading up to the Second World War. But does this mean that we are all destined for another world war? Is World War III truly on the horizon? Well, as disappointing as this answer might sound, the answer to that question is a solid maybe. While there are many similarities between now and the days leading up to World War II, there are also many differences. The world's culture, economy, supply chains, ideals, and technology are all vastly different from where they were in the 1930s. I've used examples earlier talking about China's position in the world, as well as the US not being able to fully pull away from the world system just because the world is so dependent on it. And also seeing how wars like the one currently going on in Ukraine would have previously been pretty small scale and inconsequential, but now actually have the ability to strangle supply chains, change international doctrine, and starve entire nations overnight. There's also the issue of global population decrease, in where the birth rates in many countries has started to go down steadily over the years, meaning that many nations are going to be a lot less likely to want to give up their young workforce in order to fight a war, considering the young workforce is now a hot commodity. And at the end of the day, there's arguably the biggest deterrent of them all, the end of the world at the hands of nuclear weapons. I mean, let's face it, without nuclear weapons, the Cold War would have probably turned hot very quickly, considering the amount of tension between the US and Soviet Union put them on a collision course for war almost since the Soviet Union's inception. And obviously, due to the invention of nuclear weapons, issues like the Cuban Missile Crisis never did turn hot and cooler heads were able to prevail. However, none of this actually rules out the possibility of war. We saw plenty of close calls during the Cold War, i.e. in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we've also been seeing clearly in recent days that there are a growing number of people in places of power that fear that nuclear launch button less and less. And one day it is possible that tensions just might become too great and the world may once again be forced to fight. Unfortunately, we'll just have to wait and see, and all we can do for now is continue to try to resolve our differences peacefully and diplomatically.